Chapter 3 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendell. This recording is in the public domain. The Farm in Upper Austria. The following morning the Müller family and Teresa Runkel boarded the boat in the canal which should take them up current to Linz. It was most exciting for Ferdinand, who had never been on the Danube before, but to Teresa it was quite usual, for she always made the journey to and from her home by way of the river. There was a great deal of excitement upon the quay. The fish boats had come in with their supply for the day, and fishermen were shouting themselves hoarse in their endeavors to overshout their competitors. The children seated themselves in the bow of the boat, that they might miss nothing of the scenery which is so delightful near Vienna, with its green banks, its thick forests, and its distant mountains. "Do you know what that grim castle is over there on the left?" asked Herr Müller. "Oh, yes," replied Teresa quickly. "That is the castle of Griefenstein." "Then you know its history?" asked Herr Müller. "Yes, indeed," answered the child. "Sometimes the sister who takes me home tells me, and sometimes father. But doesn't Ferdinand know it?" "No," answered the boy. "I haven't been on the river before," as if it required some explanation for his seeming ignorance. "Then tell it to him, please," said Teresa, "for it is a splendid tale. Long ages ago, this castle belonged to a lord who was, like all noblemen of that time, very fond of adventure. Whenever the least opportunity offered to follow his king, he would take up his sword and his shield and his coat of mail and hie him off to the wars. Now, the lord of the castle had a young and beautiful wife, whose wonderful golden locks were a never-ending delight to him. Having a great deal of time upon her hands, and neighbors being few and far between, the lady of the castle passed her time in arranging her magnificent hair in all sorts of fashions, some very simple, while others were most intricate and effective. It chanced that one day, after an absence of several months, the lord of the castle returned. Hastening to his wife's boudoir, he found her before her mirror dressing her hair in most bewitching fashion. After greeting her, he remarked about her elaborate head-dress, and laughingly the young wife asked her husband how he liked it. "It is much too handsome," he replied, "for a young woman whose husband is away to the wars. It is not well for a woman to be so handsome." And without further word, he seized the sword which hung at his side, removed it from its scabbard, and with one stroke cut off the beautiful locks of his young wife. But no sooner had he done so than he was angry with himself for his display of temper. He rushed from the room to cool his anger, when whom did he run into in the corridor but the castle chaplain. The poor young lord was so ashamed of himself for his ungovernable temper, that, with even less reason than before, he seized the frightened and astonished chaplain by the two shoulders, dragged him down the castle steps, and threw him into the dungeon. "Now," said he, after bolting the door securely, "pray, my good man, that the day may be hastened when the balustrade of my castle steps may become so worn by the hands of visitors that it may hold the hair of my wife, which I have cut off in my folly." There is nothing so unreasonable as a man in anger. I presume had the cook of the castle chanced to come in the way of my lord's anger, he too would have been thrown into the dungeon, and all would have starved, just to appease the temper of the impossible lord. Fortunately, the cook, or the hostler, or any of the knights or attendants of the castle did not appear, and thus was averted a great calamity. When the lord had had time to calm down a bit, he realized how unjust had been his actions. It was impossible to restore his wife's hair, but at least he might release the chaplain. A castle without a priest is indeed a sorry place. In his haste to descend the steps to the dungeon, the lord caught his foot. Perhaps his own sword, which had been the means of his folly, tripped him. In any event, he fell down the entire flight and was picked up quite dead. "It served him quite right," interrupted Ferdinand. "Oh, but that wasn't the end of the lord, by any means," continued Herr Müller, smiling. "He is doomed to wander about his castle until the balustrade has been worn so deep that it will hold 2 heads of hair like those he cut from his wife. The penitent lord has roamed about the castle for many a year, crying out to all who pass, 'Greif den Stein! Greif den Stein!' Grasp the stone." Long ago he realized how foolish had been his actions, but although he has heartily repented, yet may he never know the rest of his grave until the balustrade has been worn hollow." "And does he yet wander there?" asked Ferdinand. "So they say, but one cannot see him except at night. There are many who claim to have heard him calling out, 'Greif den Stein,' but although I have been up and down the river many times, sometimes in the daytime and sometimes at night, I, myself, have never heard the ghostly voice." "I have always felt sorrier for the poor lad without her beautiful golden hair," observed Teresa, after a moment's silence, "and I always felt glad to think the lord had to be punished for his wickedness. But somehow, hearing you tell the story, Herr Müller, I wish his punishment might not last much longer. For he was truly sorry, wasn't he?" Herr Müller looked quizzically at his wife, and they both turned their heads from the earnest faces of the children. "Do you find the old legends of the Danube interesting, Teresa?" asked Herr Müller, as the boat sped along, and the children maintained silence. "Oh, I love all sorts of tales," the child replied. "Father tells us some occasionally, but I am home so little of the time now I do not hear as many as I used to. In the summer days we are always so busy at the farm we do not have the time for story-telling as we do in the winter days." "Austria is full of tales about lords and ladies, ghosts and towers, but the Danube legends are not as well known as those of the Rhine. Have you ever heard that story concerning the Knight of Rauheneck, near Baden?" "No, Herr Müller," replied Teresa. "Well, it isn't much of a tale when you compare it with the Habsburg legends and the Greifenstein, and Stock im Eisen, but then it is worth telling." "Begin," commanded the young son, in playful mood. "Well, near Baden there stands a formidable fortress called Rauheneck, where lived a knight in former years. As he was about to go to war, and might return after many years, and perhaps never, he decided to hide the treasures of the castle and place a spell upon them, so that none might touch them but those for whom they were intended. So, in secrecy, he mounted to the summit of the great tower of the castle, and on the battlement he planted a cherry stone, saying as he did so, 'From this stone shall spring forth a tree, a mighty cherry tree. From the trunk of the tree shall be fashioned a cradle, and in that cradle shall be rocked a young baby, who, in later years, shall become a priest. To this priest shall my treasure belong. But even he may not be able to find the treasure until another cherry tree shall have grown upon the tower, from a stone dropped by a bird of passage. When all these conditions have been complied with, then shall the priest find the treasure at the foot of my tree, and not until then.' Then the careful knight, fearing for the safety of his treasure, even after such precautions, called upon a ghost to come and watch over the castle tower, that peradventure daring robbers, who might presume to thrust inside the spells which bound the treasure, would fear to cope with a ghost." "And did the priest ever come?" queried Teresa. "Not yet, child. The cherry tree at the top of the tower is but yet a sapling. There are long years yet to wait." "But we do not believe in ghosts, father," interrupted Ferdinand. "Why could not some one go and dig at the root of the tree and see if the treasure were really there?" "One could, if he chose, no doubt," answered Herr Müller, "but no one has." "Would you, Ferdinand?" asked Teresa. "Oh, I might, if I were a grown man and had a lot of soldiers with me." "Do you know another legend, Herr Müller?" asked Teresa shortly. "Well, there is the legend of Endersdorf in Moravia. A shepherd once lived in the neighborhood, and although he had always been exceedingly poor, often almost to the verge of starvation, yet one morning his neighbors found that he had suddenly become exceedingly rich. Everyone made conjectures concerning the source of his wealth, but none of them became the confidant of the shepherd, so that none were ever the wiser. The erstwhile poor shepherd left his humble cot and built himself a magnificent estate and palace upon the spot. He surrounded himself with retainers and sportsmen, and gave himself up quite naturally to a life of ease and indolence. Most of his time was spent in following the hounds, but with all his newly acquired wealth, and notwithstanding the memory of days when a few pence meant a fortune to him, the shepherd lost all sense of pity, and none about the countryside were quite so penurious and selfish as he. To such poor wayfarers as accosted him, in mercy's name to befriend them, he turned a deaf ear, until his name was the synonym for all that was miserable and hard-hearted. Now it happened that one day a poor beggar came to the gate of the rich shepherd, asking for alms. The shepherd was about to leave the gate in company with a noisy crowd of hunters and followers, on his way to the chase. Taking no pity on the poor man's condition, he suddenly conceived the idea of making the beggar his prey. "He is sport for us, good men," he cried. "Let us drive the beggar before us with our whips, and see him scamper lively." Whereupon, following the action of their host, the entire company raised their whips, set spurs to their horses, and drove the trembling, frightened, outraged man from before them. "Now has your hour come," cried out the old man, as he turned and defied his assailants. "May all the curses of heaven fall upon your heads, ye hard-hearted lot of roisterers!" At the word, the sky, which had before been cloudless, grew suddenly black. The lightning flashed, the thunder rolled. The very ground under their feet shook, cracked, and opened, swallowing the shepherd, his followers, their horses, dogs, and every vestige of his estate vanished. In its place arose a lake whose dark waters tossed and moaned in strange fashion. On stormy days, even to this present day, when the waters of the lake are lashing themselves in fury, the shepherd of the hard heart can be seen passing across the waves, his whip raised to strike some unseen object, a black hunting dog behind him. How long his punishment may last, no one knows, but he can always be seen just as he was when the earthquake swallowed him up. "Isn't it strange?" observed Teresa. "But every one of the tales end in the punishment of the wicked knight." "Of course," remarked Ferdinand. "They wouldn't be tales at all if the wrongdoer was allowed to go free. Wouldn't they, father?" "Indeed not. But now it's time for breakfast. Would you like to eat on deck? It is so perfect a day, it is a pity to go indoors." This suggestion appealed wonderfully to the children, and Herr Müller left them to order the meal served upon the deck. As night fell, the boat docked at Linz. Herr Runkel was waiting on the quay with a heavy wagon and a team of horses to drive them to the farm. It was a beautiful drive in the bright moonlight, and the lights of Linz twinkled below them, while the Danube sparkled in the distance, just like a fairy world. It was very late when they reached the farmhouse. Frau Runkel greeted them cordially, and immediately after helping them off with their wraps, poured out steaming hot coffee to warm them up, the night air having been a trifle chilly. Ferdinand went directly to his room after coffee was served. It was on the opposite side of the house, on the ground floor. The farmhouse was but 1 story high, with a lofty attic above. In one corner of the large bedroom stood a canopied bed of dark wood, elaborately painted in bright colors, on head and footboard, with designs of flowers and birds. There were 2 small, stiff-backed wooden chairs, a night-table upon which stood a brass candlestick, and an enormous wardrobe or chest for his clothes. All the furnishings of the room, even to the rug by the bed, were the handiwork of the occupants of the farmhouse, for no true Austrian peasant would condescend to purchase these household necessities from a shop. Between 2 voluminous feather beds Ferdinand slept soundly, nor did he stir until he heard voices in the garden. Hastily dressing, he made his way into the living-room, where breakfast had already been partaken of by the others. "I'm so sorry to be late," he apologized shamefacedly. "Why didn't you call me, mother?" he asked, as he turned to the one who must naturally share the responsibility of her children's shortcomings. "We thought to let you have your rest," answered Frau Müller. "Your day will be very full. You evidently enjoyed your downy bed." "Oh, it was great. Let us get one, mother." "I used to sleep under one when I was a girl," replied Frau Müller, "but no one in the city uses them any more. The woolly blankets have quite superseded them." "You may take yours home with you, if you like," said Frau Runkel. "We have geese enough to make more." "Now," said Herr Runkel, "if you are all ready, we'll go over and pay our respects to father and mother." "Then your parents do not live with you?" asked Herr Müller, a little astonished. "No, that is not the custom among us. You see, when I got married, father made over the farm and all its appurtenances to me, being the eldest son. Then he built himself another home, just over in the field there," and Herr Runkel pointed to a tiny, cozy cottage some few hundred paces away. "What a splendid thing to be the eldest son," remarked Herr Müller. "Perhaps it is," replied his host, "but it entails a great responsibility as well. You see, after the ceremony of deeding the farm away to me, I am called upon to settle an allowance upon my parents during their lifetime." "That's but right," assented Herr Müller, "seeing that they have given you everything they possess, and which they have acquired with such toil and privation." "Yes, but father received the farm from his father in just the same manner, although he has enlarged it so that it is bigger and better. But in addition to father and mother," continued the farmer, "I have all my brothers and sisters to look after. There is Teresa at the convent in Vienna, there is Frederick at the gymnasium in Linz, and there is Max, an apprentice, in Zara. These must all be cared for, and I can tell you, Müller, it's a responsible position, that of being the eldest son." "But you weren't called upon, Franz," replied his friend, "to provide so bountifully for each." "No, but what would you have?" he replied. "I have tried to be a dutiful son, and," he added, his eyes twinkling as he glanced at his wife, "I've been sort of lenient towards father and the children, because father let me off so lightly when he boxed my ears for the last time." "Boxed your ears?" exclaimed Herr Müller in astonishment. "What had you done to deserve such disgrace?" "Well, that was part of the ceremony. When the farm was made over to me, it's the custom, before signing the deed, for the owner to make the rounds of his estate with his family. When he comes to each of the 4 corner posts, he boxes the ears of the new owner. Now, father might have boxed mine roundly had he chosen, for I was somewhat of a rollicker in my youth," and the genial farmer chuckled softly, "but father was sparing of my feelings. Don't you believe he deserved a recompense?" "He certainly did," answered his friend, and they all laughed heartily over the matter. Meanwhile they had gained the entrance of the dower house, as the home of the aged couple was called. As Herr Müller had not seen the parents of his friend since childhood, there were many years of acquaintanceship to bridge over, and Ferdinand, fascinated, listened to the conversation, for this old couple were most interesting persons to talk with. After returning from church, the family gathered on the wide veranda under the eaves, the women with their knitting, which is not considered improper even on Sundays among Austrian women. This veranda in the peasant home in Upper Austria is a most important part of the house. It is protected from the elements by the enormous overhanging eaves above, running the entire side of the house. Heavy timbers support it, green with growing vines which climb from the porch boxes filled with gaily blossoming flowers. It is a tiny garden brought to one's sitting room. The birds twitter in the sunlight as they fly in and out of their nests under the eaves, and here the neighbors gossip and drink coffee and munch delicious cakes. In fact, it is the sole sitting room of the family during warm days, for no peasant woman would think of shutting herself in a room to do her work. One can always work to better advantage in the sunlight and open air. The children rambled about the farm and outbuildings. The farmhouse was very long and deep and low, with a long slanting roof. The front door was of heavy timbers, upon which was a design of St. Martin outlined in nails, the work of the farmer, while small crosses at either side of the door were considered sufficient protection from the evil spirits who might wish to attack the family within. The interior of the farmhouse was very simple. A large vestibule, called the Laube or bower, served as a means of communication between the different parts of the house. The sleeping rooms were ranged on one side, while the dining and living room occupied the other, with the kitchen just beyond. The Gesindestube or living room was very plain, with its bare floors and darkened walls, a tile stove in one corner, benches about the walls and chests, some plain, some elaborately decorated and carved, occupied whatever space was left. Here were kept the household linens and the wardrobes for the family, as no Austrian peasant home is built with closets as we have in America. That evening Herr Runkel said to Ferdinand, "Tomorrow, my boy, we work. Would you like to help?" "Oh, it would be jolly," replied the lad. After a moment's hesitation he added, "What kind of work? Hoeing potatoes or weeding the garden?" These two tasks were the only ones the lad was familiar with upon his uncle's farm in Tyrol. The farmer laughed. "No, we won't do that," he said. "We will leave that to the servants. But we will make shoes." "Make shoes?" exclaimed the child, incredulously. "Really make them yourself? I've never made shoes," he added, doubting whether he might be allowed now to assist. "Why not?" answered Herr Runkel. "You know we are very old-fashioned here, and as we have so far to go to the shops, why we don't go. We let the workmen come to us. This is an off time of the season, so we have the tailors and the shoemakers and all sorts of folk come and help us with such things as we can't do ourselves, for, you know, we make everything we use on the farm and everything we wear." "Oh, how fine!" said Ferdinand. "Yes, and we have jolly times too," continued the farmer, "for when work is over we play. Isn't that right?" Ferdinand went to bed that night with visions of tailors and shoemakers and harness makers and what not in his head, until he fell asleep. End of chapter 3. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer.